This spring, the influential caucus of Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian state lawmakers tapped Bria Nickerson to serve as their new executive director, and she joins us in the Capitol Press Room studio to discuss her new role. Thanks for making the time, Bria, and congrats on the new job.
Thank you so much. And Dave, thank you for inviting me. This is a big honor of mine to be here, so thank you again.
Well, we appreciate your time. So for starters, let's discuss the role of the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus, because while it's so well known at the Capitol that it's just called the caucus, outside of Planet Albany, I don't know how familiar people are with the organization. So how would you describe the group and its mission?
Yeah. So the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus is a bicameral and bipartisan governmental body. So breaking that down, there are members of both the Assembly and the Senate, and then there are members of both parties as part of the caucus. We are currently comprised of 80 members, so pretty large body. And they are each united by a common interest. Essentially, they care about the legislative process and the impact that it has on Black, Hispanic, and Latino and Asian communities. So one thing that the caucus does in terms of the legislative process is advocacy. So they advocate for and organize around different policy issues and different policy areas that are pertinent to the constituents that they serve. So once again, those Black, Latino, and Asian communities. Another really important part of what the caucus does, and I think personally my favorite thing, something I followed for a while before I actually became staff of the caucus, is the people's budget. So as part of the budget process, which we know happens throughout the legislative session, the caucus is ensuring that there is equity in government funding, ensuring that constituents throughout all of New York State, not just the city, are tapping into those resources and services and opportunities that the government is offering. One way, though, that the caucus specifically advocates for during the budget process is with what we call our people's budget. This is an annual document. We put it out generally between December, January, and the whole premise of the people's budget is that we invite organizations across the New York State, residents across New York State, even elected officials across New York State, to provide their budget and policy priorities that they would like to see the caucus championing and advocating on behalf of. We put it into a book and we separate it. I like to call it different chapters or categories based on specific priorities we have. So some of those look like housing might be a chapter, climate and environmental justice might be another chapter, human services may be a chapter, criminal justice might be a chapter. And in each of these sections, we have subsections that focus on these different budget and policy priorities that we receive from the organizations outside.
Well, I want to talk more about those advocacy efforts, but first, let's talk a little bit more about you. What is it about working for the caucus as executive director that you found appealing and ultimately led you into this role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess what might help is first to talk a little bit about my journey and how I even got to this point. So I attended Penn State. I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. I've always cared very deeply about racial, social, and criminal justice, of course. A lot of my focus was on Black women and Black girls and the intersection of like race, gender, and the criminal justice system. I unfortunately was a 2020 grad, so I was a pandemic grad, and being from Brooklyn, New York, this was also at the time that, we were seeing the Black Lives Matter movement taking off to extreme heights, more than maybe we've seen since it first started.
Sure, a lot of progressive criminal justice legislation made its way through Albany.
Absolutely. And being in New York City at the time that this is happening was something I really did cherish, and I always wanted to be part of that. So then in 2022, I decided, hey, it's time to go back to school, and then I pursued my master's degree in women's gender and sexuality studies, where I learned about this concept called intersectionality. It pretty much just explains that an individual's different intersecting identities can overlap and lead to both privilege and or discrimination or oppression. So understanding that concept really changed my entire perspective, and then it shapes how I approached life, but especially policy. And being in my master's program led me to want to do policy work. So from that point, I applied for a role with the Albany County Legislature, specifically working with the Legislative Black Caucus. And in my original role that I started out was like a policy research role. So my entire position was dedicated to focusing on policy issues that impacted communities of color. Then I eventually was promoted to the Director of Strategic Planning for the Legislative Black Caucus, which was one of the most amazing promotions I could have ever received. It directly led me to where I am now. When I served as the Director of Strategic Planning for the caucus, I did a lot of the work that I do now, so overseeing day-to-day operations of the caucus, shaping the policy agenda of the caucus, supervising staff, leading initiatives, managing relationships with stakeholders. So essentially many of the same responsibilities that I do now as the executive director for the state caucus are some of the things I was doing at the local level one. But I decided, as much as I loved the county and I felt that it was a great starting point for my career, I really wanted to catapult into focusing on issues that weren't just local. I wanted to be able to focus on more state level issues. Being from Brooklyn, but then also having the ability to live in the capital of New York State, being in Albany, I kind of was able to look at issues that are impacting both city residents and upstate residents. And I felt that this was a great opportunity for me to contribute to the mission of the caucus while also being able to contribute directly to policies that impact all residents of New York State.
Why do you think you've gravitated toward the jobs that are inside government as opposed to jobs outside of government where you can pressure elected officials, pressure agency officials on certain issues? Is there something that you find more appealing or effective about that route as opposed to the outsider position?
I find it energizing. Okay. There is something so energizing about coming into like a government space. It is very, very fast paced. It changes at the drop of a dime. You may be doing something one day, something the next day, maybe 1,000,001 things the same day. And I felt when it came to policy, I recognized that is the policy that you're making, whether it's at the local level or at the state level, is what then gets signed into law. So if you're at the local government like I was, those local laws and resolutions that we were passing governed Albany County. Similarly, it's interesting to now be inside of state government where I'm seeing in real time the legislative process of how we debate over certain bills and how those bills get signed into law and then govern the entire state of New York. I think that there's just something really fun about being in that environment. Plus, I love being able to network. I love working with different people and learning about the initiatives and issues that other people care about. And it also is an opportunity to work with the organizations we have relationships with to kind of help develop policy ideas.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the caucus is bipartisan, and while you have mostly all Democratic members, there are a handful of Republican members, and I think that speaks to the fact that people of color are not a monolith. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, how do you settle on whatever the policy decisions are for the caucus, for the priorities of the caucus, for example? I mean, is there a vote internally? Because maybe there are differences of opinions about the best way to help certain communities.
So as you mentioned, we're not a monolith, and that even means on party lines. We don't always agree on the same issues,
sure.
But I also think that's the benefit of having such a large caucus that has different ideas. We're able to kind of tap into different areas of expertise or even different areas of experience to be able to come together and say, hey, from an educational perspective or from, in practice, the work that I've been doing, this is the information and knowledge that I have. Someone else may be coming from the perspective of, well, these are the experiences that I lived. And of course, those are just as valid. And for me, it always means that we are going to give everyone an opportunity to share their feelings on different policy issues. One of the ways we kind of do this is amongst the caucus, we have different subcommittees, mm-hmm. and those subcommittees are categorized based on the issue area. So, for example, one issue that the caucus cares very deeply about is gun violence and obviously gun violence prevention and safety measures. So we have a gun violence subcommittee, and in that subcommittee is an opportunity for members who maybe have different bills related to gun violence to come and discuss those bills. And then at any general caucus meeting, we use that space for all members to discuss any bills that that they are working on, anything that they feel that maybe needs any edits, any amendments. So any amendments that maybe they would like to be made for a bill. That's pretty much what we use our general meetings and our subcommittee meetings for.
You mentioned there are 80 members in the caucus right now. There's 213 seats in total in the state legislature. So that means more than a third of the members are in the caucus, which would suggest that's a large voting block. How do you anticipate, once you're in this role in the 2027 legislative session, mobilizing that impressive block so that it can sway policy in New York? Because not all of the priorities in, say, the people's budget end up in the state budget, and not all of the different, say, criminal progressive priorities like the Robert Brooks Blueprint for Justice and Reform necessarily make it to the finish line. So have you thought at all about what an effective advocacy campaign looks like in the future?
So actually, that's one of the things that I'm actively working on. So a lot of times people only think that the caucus is active from January to June, when in actuality, the caucus is working year round. And in that off session, we use that opportunity to, one, identify other stakeholders or other community organizations who we may want to partner with on policy. We also have meetings amongst the caucus to just discuss any policy ideas that they have or something that they are hoping to advocate for in the next legislative session. One thing that we do, in addition to the people's budget, we do also invite members and community stakeholders to submit policy that is a priority to them. So when we have policy that the caucus members are submitting to the caucus office, what I do personally is I organize all of that information and I look at all of the different bills. Maybe I'll group them into categories based on like our, those subheadings going back to the original subheadings I mentioned in the people's budget. Sometimes I will organize them and use that as a guide of, okay, these seem to be the issues that a lot of our members care about, this specific issue area. It's also important to recognize that with one session, we can't do everything, but we're always looking for more opportunities and more avenues to continue advocating and to continue working. So in the off session, I'm having meetings. I'm identifying those stakeholders we should be working with. I'm continuing on with a lot of our initiatives. For example, we're getting ready to participate in our Timbuktu summer climate initiative. That is a huge thing for us, and it's really important because it focuses on the intersection of young people and climate justice, which is something that we care very deeply about. So the summer and honestly the rest of the year prior to coming back to legislative session is used preparing for legislative session. At least for me as the executive director, I'm excited about the opportunity to work with the different members. One of the things that I love about having an 80-member body is it's so many different people and personalities to work with and get to learn from. So I am making it a mission for myself to learn as much about my members and the things that they care about so that when we get into next legislative session, I can do my due diligence of being their supporter.
It doesn't mean you have 80 different headaches then? Sounds like you have a real glass half full perspective on it.
It's important to just recognize in government, everyone's going to have their own personality, staff and members alike. And I think that we need to focus on what our ultimate goals are. I think it's inevitable that sometimes conflict will arise, but what matters is making sure that we are, one, working as a team, and I always defer to the chairwoman. So if there are ever any questions that I may have, I always check with the chair and see how she feels and what her guidance is and go from there.
And it's an interesting dynamic because both of the legislative leaders are people of color, Andre Stewart Cousins and Carl Hastie, but the chair of the organization is a rank and file member, Mikhail Szilagyi. What is that like? I mean, are there times where, Carl Hastie's in the room and it's like, nope, got to focus on Mikhail Szilagyi because here she's top dog?
So for me, unfortunately, I haven't really had the opportunity to see everything yet, being that I came in towards the middle, I should say, of May. May 11th actually is when I started.
Okay.
So I'm actually looking forward to the legislative session and being able to sit in the rooms with the leadership. I mean, I think it's so important that we have this type of representation in our leadership. We have people that are Black, that are Latino, that are Asian in positions of power. And I think that when you get into these rooms and you're having conversations with the different legislators, with all of the members and with leadership, it's important to just listen, starting out, listen, see what people's perspectives are. What are some of their concerns? I love to take notes. So when I go into any meeting, I'm just taking notes of what everyone is saying so that I can use those notes to think about, okay, what direction should we go? Should we go this direction with something? Should we go another direction?
Do you think there's ever going to be a time in American history, or maybe New York history more specifically, where a caucus like this is not necessary, that we're going to be post-racial society, or given America's long and deep history of racial and ethnic discrimination, this is always going to be something that is going to need to play an important role in government?
I think that every state legislature could benefit from having a caucus. And it doesn't just have to be a caucus on the basis of race or ethnicity, but a caucus on any specific issue, or a caucus for any group that maybe is marginalized or maybe is underrepresented in policy. There's always going to be a need for that. And I feel like in New York State, though we tend to be the leader in a lot of different things, I think it's also important that we recognize there's still more that we can do. And having a caucus who cares, with members who care about so many different areas, different policy areas, this is a great way to ensure that as many people across the state of New York are feeling represented, are feeling like their needs are being covered and being addressed. So yeah, we're going to always need the caucus.
Well, we've been speaking with Bria Nickerson. She's the executive director for the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus. Bria, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.